The sky cracked open like glass hit by a hammer, and through it poured a fleet so massive that daylight itself seemed to retreat. Children screamed, dogs howled, and somewhere in the chaos a street preacher shouted this was the receipt for humanity's overdue sins. News anchors, their hair perfect but their voices trembling, told the world to stay calm even as entire cities disappeared under shadows larger than continents. Then came the broadcast, projected across every screen, every device, even the cracked face of a soldier's phone in the trenches. The alien warlord, all teeth and arrogance, leaned close to the camera and sneered. 7 billion? That is not an army. That is a rounding error. He laughed, and the sound was like steel scraping bone. The panic began instantly. Presidents and prime ministers shouted over one another through frantic video conferences, their voices carrying the desperation of people who knew they were suddenly no more important than anyone else. In one corner of the world, a general slammed his fist against the digital map, insisting they could use sheer numbers to overwhelm the invaders. Another general countered that most humans could not even run 5 kilometers without collapsing. The arguments turned into insults, and for one absurd moment, the supposed leaders of Earth looked like bickering uncles at a ruined family barbecue. Meanwhile, the aliens kept laughing. They showed their endless armies spawning in perfect formation, row upon row, millions multiplying into billions, each soldier identical, disciplined, and terrifying. To them, Earth was not even a battle. It was accounting. In a muddy trench outside the ruined outskirts of what had once been Chicago, Sergeant Ethan Cross snorted at the transmission. His helmet was dented, his rifle jammed, and his boots were soaked through with rain and the kind of mud that stank like death. He was 35 but looked older, not from years but from experience, the kind of man who had fought too many fights he had no business surviving. He turned to the fresh recruit beside him, a boy whose hands trembled so badly he could barely reload his weapon. "You hear that? We're a rounding error. Congratulations, kid. You're not even worth a decimal point." The boy blinked, then let out a nervous laugh. In that moment, with alien ships blotting out the sky, humor was a weapon sharper than steel. The soldiers around him did not laugh. They stared at the towering figures on the screens, at the impossible scale of what was coming. Some prayed. Some cursed. One sat silently, rocking back and forth, whispering that he should have listened to his mother and stayed in dental school. Above them, thunder cracked, though no storm was brewing. It was the sound of another ship entering orbit, another piece of an uncountable puzzle. The warlord on the broadcast gestured to the heavens. "This is mathematics, humans. We are infinity. You are subtraction. Your defeat is not a possibility. It is an equation." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Equations. Numbers. It sounded clean, logical, absolute. But Ethan had grown up in the cluttered backstreets of Detroit, where survival was never about neat sums or perfect odds. He remembered his grandmother's voice, raspy but sharp, as she taught him how to play cards in a smoky kitchen. "Kid, don't matter how many they got in their hand. What matters is if you know how to play yours." That lesson had stayed with him through bar fights, street brawls, boot camp, and now the brink of humanity's extinction. He spat into the mud, adjusted his helmet, and smirked at the screen. "Guess they never played poker in space." The aliens pressed their advantage quickly. Massive blasts rained down, carving craters the size of stadiums. Bridges folded like paper. Skyscrapers toppled in waves of dust and fire. Civilians stampeded through streets, colliding with soldiers trying desperately to hold lines that no longer existed. Yet through all this chaos, Ethan did not panic. He watched, he listened, and he noticed. The alien soldiers moved with mechanical precision, but their formations were repetitive. The way they advanced, the rhythm of their deployments, even the angle of their landing craft, it was all so perfect it became predictable. And predictable was something Ethan could use. Back at the command tent, officers barked conflicting orders. One insisted on mass mobilization. Another demanded immediate surrender. The shouting reached a fever pitch until Ethan, uninvited and unnoticed, muttered just loud enough for the nearest colonel to hear. Quantity's useless if you don't know where to put it. The colonel glared at him, ready to dismiss the sergeant as a mud-stained grunt who had no business speaking, but Ethan's words lingered. He spoke them again, clearer this time, not with arrogance but with the calm certainty of someone who had already lived too long on borrowed time. They've got infinity, sure. But infinity's dumb if it doesn't think. The colonel rolled his eyes and turned back to his maps, but a few other officers glanced at Ethan differently. He was just one man among millions, but there was something unsettling in his lack of fear. When the next blast hit, shaking the ground and cutting the lights, the officers scrambled. Ethan just kept watching the skies, memorizing the timing of the alien strikes. A pattern was there. A flaw. Small, almost invisible, but real. And once you see a flaw, you can't unsee it. The trench shook again. Dust rained down. Somewhere nearby, someone screamed for a medic. The broadcast flickered back on, showing the alien warlord's face, smug and gleaming with victory. He leaned in close, whispering as if sharing a secret with the entire planet. Do not resist. Do not hope. You are outnumbered. You are outlived. You are outthought. His smile stretched too wide, and the screen went black. Ethan leaned back against the trench wall, his rifle still jammed, his boots still sinking into mud. Around him, men and women wept, cursed, prayed. Above him, ships moved like gods across the heavens. And yet, against all reason, Sergeant Ethan Cross chuckled. Not loud, not mocking, but a low, certain laugh. Because he had seen it. A sliver of miscalculation. A weakness in infinity. And while the world shook with fear, Ethan whispered into the chaos, almost to himself. Numbers don't win wars. People do. The morning after the first wave felt like waking up in the ruins of a dream. Cities that had stood for centuries were now jagged silhouettes against smoke-choked skies. The alien warlords were still broadcasting their arrogance across every channel, repeating the same phrase like it was scripture. Numbers decide destiny. Their voices were sharp, almost gleeful, as if they could taste humanity's despair. In the middle of this, Sergeant Ethan Cross sat on an overturned crate, eating a half-crushed protein bar, chewing as if nothing around him had changed. His squad mates watched him in disbelief. One finally asked why he wasn't panicking. Ethan only shrugged. Because they're wrong. Numbers only matter if you don't know how to count right. This line made its way into a briefing later that morning, though not by Ethan's choice. A junior officer who overheard him repeated the words to a room full of generals, desperate to make sense of the disaster. The reaction was as expected. One general scoffed that soldiers in the mud should not meddle in strategy. Another muttered that humanity had no time for philosophy. Yet the phrase hung in the air, refusing to die. Ethan himself was dragged into the meeting shortly after, still smelling of smoke and mud, standing in a room of medals, pressed uniforms, and people who looked like they had never touched dirt in their lives. They asked him to explain. He told them flatly that he had seen patterns in the alien deployments. Their strength was infinite, but their imagination wasn't. If humans stopped trying to fight infinity with infinity and instead struck at the weak points, they could turn the tide. The response was laughter. Not the wild alien kind but the bitter human kind, the kind used to dismiss an idea before it takes root. They told him to return to his trench. They told him his job was to shoot when ordered, not to think. Ethan left without argument, but his eyes carried a glint that unsettled even the sternest officers. Back at camp, his ragtag unit welcomed him with jokes and sarcasm. Private Lewis, the nervous recruit from before, teased him about trying to outwit generals with high school math. Corporal Diaz, the medic, threw a ration bar at him and told him not to get himself executed for insubordination. And then there was Sam, the hacker, a wiry figure with glasses that always slipped down his nose, who leaned in close and whispered, "You're right though. Their code's repetitive too. I've been scanning their transmissions. It loops like bad software. It's almost funny." That night the squad sat around a cracked lamp, swapping grim humor while alien searchlights scoured the skies. For a few hours, laughter was louder than fear. Meanwhile, somewhere in orbit above Earth, the alien warlords argued in their own strange way. Their council chamber was a cathedral of glass and steel, filled with holograms of Earth's cities like trophies waiting to be claimed. Warlord Kthar slammed a clawed fist against the table, demanding that resistance be crushed faster. Another warlord mocked humans as mathematically illiterate livestock. A third grew obsessed with Earth's internet, confused yet fascinated by memes about cats and pizza. Their arguments were ridiculous at times, but behind the humor lay dangerous arrogance. They saw humans as predictable, a species too sentimental and disorganized to matter. What none of them yet realized was that they had just placed their focus on the wrong battlefield. They were counting numbers. Ethan was counting mistakes. The first real test came 2 days later. Ethan's squad was sent on what the brass called a containment maneuver, which was polite code for suicide mission. The aliens had landed 1,000 units near the outskirts of St. Louis, and Earth's commanders ordered scattered squads to slow them down while civilians evacuated. Ethan's unit dug in behind the ruins of an old shopping mall, where mannequins with missing limbs stared eerily from shattered windows. The odds were impossible. For every human with a rifle, there were 100 aliens with weapons far beyond understanding. Lewis whispered a prayer. Diaz checked her dwindling supply of bandages. Sam set up his laptop, rigged with stolen alien tech, and muttered that if they were going to die, at least they could give the enemy a bad headache. When the aliens advanced, their formation was flawless, lines of identical soldiers moving in perfect rhythm. It would have been terrifying if not for the predictability. Ethan waited until the last possible moment, then barked an order that made no sense to his squad. Instead of firing directly, they targeted a collapsing parking garage on the far left. The aliens, confused, adjusted their march without hesitation, stepping directly into the trap Ethan had predicted. Tons of concrete thundered down, crushing entire columns. Sam hacked into their comms, broadcasting false orders that caused half of the surviving units to turn on each other in mechanical confusion. By the time the dust cleared, 1,000 had been reduced to a handful. The squad barely fired a shot. News of the miracle reached command by nightfall. The generals were quick to take credit, claiming the maneuver had been part of the plan. But whispers spread among soldiers in the field. They spoke of the sergeant who laughed at numbers, the man who saw infinity as just another game to beat. The aliens noticed too. Their broadcasts grew darker, less mocking and more unsettled. One transmission even called Ethan by name, branding him an anomaly. To the alien mind, he was no longer a soldier. He was an error in the equation. The recognition was a strange kind of victory, but it came with weight. That night, after the squad's unexpected success, Ethan sat apart from the others. The fire crackled low, the night air thick with smoke and silence. Diaz patched Lewis's arm while Sam tinkered with broken circuits. For the first time, no one made jokes. They all knew the truth. If the aliens could replicate endlessly, then even victories like today were pebbles thrown at a tidal wave. And yet Ethan smiled, not with arrogance but with stubborn defiance. He saw their fear in the alien broadcasts. Fear meant cracks. Cracks meant something could break. The next morning the world awoke to new horror. The aliens revealed their replication engines to the entire planet. They showed vast chambers where soldiers were spawned in endless streams, multiplying like bacteria in a petri dish. It was their way of crushing morale, to prove that no matter how many victories humans scraped together, more enemies would always rise. Entire cities fell silent as the images played, hope snuffed out like a candle in the wind. But Ethan only leaned forward, staring at the broadcasts with narrowed eyes. He did not see infinity. He saw machinery. Machinery could fail. Machinery could break. The others asked him what he was thinking. He said nothing, but in his silence, the seed of rebellion had already taken root. And when the day ended with the news that Earth's best fleet had been annihilated in 3 minutes, the generals were despondent, the civilians hopeless, and the aliens triumphant. But Ethan grinned in the shadows of the trench, whispering words his squad barely heard. Good. Now we know their trick. The ruins of St. Louis still smoked when Ethan Cross began pressing his ideas into action. The generals ignored him, the politicians dismissed him, but the soldiers in the mud listened. They had seen him turn impossible odds into survival, and survival was a currency more valuable than orders. He gathered his squad in the shell of a library, its books burned to ash, its marble columns cracked. There, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten knowledge, Ethan laid out his plan. "We don't fight infinity head-on," he told them. "We fight like chess players. Every piece matters, every move forces theirs. They don't think in moves. They think in waves." His squad stared at him, half believing, half terrified. Private Lewis raised his hand like a schoolboy and muttered, "So, what if they've got 1,000,000 queens?" Ethan grinned. "Then we make the board too small for them to use them." The alien warlords were not blind to resistance. In orbit, their council mocked Earth with arrogant certainty. They projected human battle plans onto glowing charts, showing how every attempt to confront them ended in slaughter. To them, Earth's armies were ants throwing pebbles at an avalanche. Yet there was unease beneath the bravado. Reports of one human squad outmaneuvering larger forces were dismissed as glitches, but glitches unsettled them. Warlord Cthar slammed a claw against the table, growling that humans should not be capable of breaking formations so easily. Another sneered that humanity survived only by chance. A third, amused by Earth's strange humor, insisted that humans were simply too foolish to understand when they were beaten. Their laughter echoed through their steel cathedral, even as cracks in their perfect arithmetic began to form. Back on the ground, Ethan's squad began experimenting with guerrilla tactics. They struck quickly, vanished into ruins, and turned the alien precision into a weakness. One night, using nothing but scavenged explosives and Sam's talent for hacking, they lured an alien unit into a derelict subway tunnel. The tunnel collapsed with a roar, crushing hundreds under tons of stone. Another time, they tricked an enemy column into chasing them through a narrow bridge, then detonated charges that sent the entire structure tumbling into a river. Each time, Ethan studied the aliens' responses. They reacted swiftly, perfectly, and always predictably. They never improvised. They never hesitated. They were machines of flesh, ruled by math instead of instinct. And that made them vulnerable. Sam provided humor in the darkest moments. One evening, he hijacked an alien broadcast and slipped in a human propaganda reel filled with terrible math jokes. The feed showed aliens confused by equations like 2 + 2 = fish, while human soldiers laughed in disbelief. The aliens, unused to nonsense, actually paused mid-battle to recheck their commands. Ethan rolled his eyes but couldn't hide a smirk. Even Lewis, still trembling in firefights, managed to laugh for the first time since the invasion began. For a moment, war became bearable. Laughter was rebellion. But humor was only a thin layer over growing stakes. The aliens adapted in their way. They tightened patrols, increased replication, and poured forces into cities like they were swatting flies. Ethan's methods spread, squads adopting his strategies across different fronts. Some succeeded brilliantly, others ended in tragedy. For every alien unit destroyed, hundreds more spawned. Yet every small victory mattered because it proved the aliens could bleed, their perfection could be chipped away. Soldiers whispered Ethan's name like a rumor, the one who saw the flaw in infinity. He became a myth before he was ready for it. The turning point came in Kansas City. Thousands of civilians were trapped, surrounded by replication units that churned out soldiers like a factory spitting sparks. The generals wanted to abandon the city, claiming it was mathematically unwinnable. Ethan refused. He led his squad into the sewers beneath the city, where the stench made them gag and the darkness pressed like a weight. They planted charges along key tunnels, timing the detonations with Sam's hack signals. When the aliens advanced, they were funneled into choke points where numbers became useless. Explosions ripped through the underbelly of the city, collapsing roads and burying entire legions alive. Civilians escaped through the chaos, sprinting across rubble, while soldiers held the line. For the first time, humanity didn't just survive. They stole a city back. Yet the victory nearly cost Ethan everything. As smoke cleared, Earth commanders stormed into the city not to congratulate him but to arrest him. He had disobeyed orders, risked resources, and taken unauthorized action. Ethan stood before a tribunal of grim-faced officers who accused him of insubordination. He didn't argue. He simply told them the truth. You tried to count bodies. I counted moves. That's why we're still here. Silence filled the room. The tribunal considered making an example of him, but the roar of civilians cheering in the streets outside silenced their judgment. Ethan was released, not because the generals believed in him, but because they couldn't afford to silence a hero when morale was all that kept the world standing. Far above, the Alien War Council grew restless. Reports piled in of human resistance using tactics they had never calculated. Patterns they once predicted with certainty now fractured. Warlord Kthar demanded answers, slamming his fist again and again, sparks flying from the impact. One analyst dared suggest that humans fought not with numbers but with unpredictability. This was met with scorn, but unease spread. The infinite army was beginning to feel finite. For the first time, the aliens named their true enemy. Not Earth. Not humanity as a whole. One man. Sergeant Ethan Cross. To them, he was not a soldier. He was corruption in the system. And corruption, if not erased, spreads. On the ground, Ethan felt the shift. Soldiers who once looked at him as just another mud-covered grunt now sought his guidance. Civilians whispered his name in evacuation lines, children clutching broken dolls repeating the story of the man who tricked infinity. His squad grew closer, bound by laughter, pain, and survival. Diaz tended wounds while cursing the futility of limited supplies. Lewis learned to steady his aim, though his prayers never ceased. Sam grew bolder, laughing louder each time his hacks embarrassed the enemy. They were not just comrades. They were family. And in war, family was the only shield stronger than numbers. The cost of resistance grew heavier. Each ambush claimed friends. Each victory was written in blood. Ethan carried the weight silently, though sometimes at night he would sit alone, staring at the stars where the alien ships floated like vultures. He wondered how long they could keep going before the tide swallowed them whole. Yet every time despair clawed at him, he remembered his grandmother's voice. Play the hand, no matter the cards. He wasn't trying to beat infinity. He was trying to make infinity stumble. The moment the alien broadcast singled him out, Ethan knew the war had shifted. He was no longer a nameless soldier in the dirt but the target of an empire that did not tolerate imperfection. His squad tried to laugh it off. Sam joked that Ethan should start charging for autographs, while Diaz grumbled that fame didn't come with extra bandages. Even Lewis, nervous as always, attempted to smile though his hands trembled as he cleaned his rifle. But underneath the humor, every one of them felt the same dread. The aliens had millions, billions, an endless tide, and now all of it could be bent toward crushing one man. The very thought carried a weight heavier than their weapons. The trap came faster than expected. Ethan's unit had been ordered to scout the ruins of Denver, a mission that felt routine compared to the chaos of Kansas City. The city was a hollow skeleton, its towers reduced to jagged teeth against the gray sky. They moved carefully through the rubble, radios buzzing with static, every step echoing too loudly. That was when the streets came alive. Alien units surged from hidden pods buried beneath the asphalt, weapons gleaming in the haze. This was no random patrol. This was a net closing in. Ethan shouted for cover, pulling Lewis down as energy blasts scorched the pavement. Sam cursed, his laptop sparking as he scrambled to jam their signals. Diaz dragged a wounded soldier into an alley, her hands already red with blood. For the first time, Ethan felt not just outnumbered but hunted. The firefight was brutal. Every move Ethan had relied on, every trick that had worked before, seemed anticipated. The aliens did not advance blindly in their usual formations. They adapted, shifted, pressed in from angles he hadn't seen them use. It was as if they had studied his very thoughts. Buildings collapsed, alleys burned, and the squad was forced into retreat after retreat. When the dust finally cleared, half their supporting units were gone, swallowed by the enemy. Ethan and his core team barely escaped through a collapsed subway tunnel, crawling through smoke and choking dust. For once, there was no laughter afterward. Just silence and the sound of Diaz weeping quietly as she worked on a soldier who would not live to see the morning. That night, as they huddled in the ruins of an abandoned school, Ethan's mask of humor cracked. He sat apart from the others, staring at his mudcake boots, feeling the loss pressing down like iron chains. Lewis approached timidly, asking if they had done something wrong, if maybe they should have fought harder. Ethan looked at him and shook his head. We fought as hard as we could. They just fought us. His voice carried no bitterness, only a weary honesty. He had always laughed in the face of numbers, but tonight the weight of arithmetic felt heavier than ever. One man could bend the rules, but could one man bend the laws of inevitability? In orbit, the Alien War Council debated their unexpected difficulties. Warlord Kthar was furious, his claws carving grooves into the steel table. He shouted that Ethan Cross was not just an error but a contagion, infecting human resistance with hope. Another warlord argued that fear would soon erase hope, that by targeting Ethan they would turn him into a liability rather than a hero. Yet another suggested something more dangerous. They should not only kill him but make a spectacle of it, break him before the eyes of his species to prove infinity remained unshaken. Their arguments roared through the chamber until they agreed. Ethan was not to be killed quietly. He was to be destroyed in a way that erased the very myth of his existence. On the ground, Ethan refused to break outwardly. He pushed his squad harder, drilling them in ruined warehouses, teaching them to fight not with strength but with rhythm, deception, and instinct. Yet every night he felt the losses weigh heavier. The squad was smaller now, fewer faces around the campfire. One night, as they prepared to ambush an alien patrol, Lewis froze, unable to lift his rifle. The boy muttered that he could not keep doing this, that every victory seemed meaningless when the tide kept coming. Ethan grabbed his shoulders, shaking him. Meaningless is lying down and waiting to die. Meaning is fighting even when it doesn't make sense. You think numbers are everything? Then remember this. You're one man. I'm one man. And we're still standing against infinity. That means we already broke the rules. The ambush succeeded, but it came at a cost. Diaz was caught in the blast of an alien grenade while dragging Lewis to safety. The medic who had patched up countless others lay broken in the rubble. Ethan carried her body himself, his face stone, his jaw clenched so tight it seemed ready to crack. When they buried her beneath the shattered remains of a church, the squad did not speak. For Ethan, it was more than the loss of a friend. It was the shattering of the fragile balance he had held between humor and despair. He did not laugh that night. He did not smile. He sat alone, fists clenched, and whispered a promise to the empty sky. You want me? You'll get me. The next day brought revelation. Through Sam's hacking, they intercepted alien transmissions that revealed something astonishing. The replication engines, the source of the endless armies, were not scattered across the stars as the aliens claimed. They were fed by a central core buried within one colossal ship, hidden in orbit like a heart pumping blood through veins. Destroy the core, and the endless tide would falter. For the first time, infinity had a center. And centers could be pierced. Ethan stared at the data, his mind burning with possibility and dread. It was suicide. It was madness. It was their only chance. The squad gathered in silence as Ethan laid out the plan. They would infiltrate the ship, sabotage the replication core, and cripple the engine of infinity. Lewis protested, insisting it was impossible. Sam muttered that even hacking their comms had been a near-death gamble, and this was 100 times riskier. But Ethan's voice was steady, carrying the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. If we don't, they'll bury us all. Every city, every child, every last trace of Earth. Numbers don't matter if you take away the machine that makes them. His words fell like steel. No jokes. No smirks. Only certainty. That night, Ethan lay awake staring at the fractured ceiling of their shelter. For the first time in weeks, he let himself imagine the end. Not just his end, but an end where Earth might stand again beneath skies free of alien shadows. It was a fragile vision, flickering in his mind like a candle in the wind. But it was enough. He whispered into the silence, not for his squad, not for the generals, not even for Earth. He whispered for himself, for Diaz, for every nameless soldier lost in the tide. One move. One hand played right. That's all it takes to break infinity. And with those words, he closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow he would march not just toward battle, but toward destiny. The order came down from high command the moment Ethan presented the plan. Denied. They called it reckless, suicidal, an insult to the fragile hope humanity still clung to. The generals shouted that they could not risk their one living symbol of resistance on a fool's errand. Ethan listened to their lectures in silence, his face unreadable, but when they dismissed him he walked out with a calmness that unsettled even his friends. Back at camp, Lewis asked if that was the end of it. Ethan shook his head. When command's wrong, you don't wait for permission. You move. The squad knew what that meant. They were going to follow him whether it was sanctioned or not, because somewhere along the line, orders had stopped mattering and trust had taken their place. The farewell before the mission was quiet and heavy. They gathered in the ruins of a half-collapsed church, its broken stained glass casting jagged shadows across the floor. Sam fiddled nervously with his equipment, making jokes about how if they died he hoped heaven at least had functioning Wi-Fi. No one laughed, but the attempt mattered. Lewis, shaking more than ever, finally confessed his fear, blurting out that he was terrified of dying without making a difference. Ethan put a hand on his shoulder, steady and grounding. Every breath we've taken since the first ship landed has made a difference. Remember that. Even hardened soldiers fighting nearby seemed to pause, glancing at Ethan's squad with a mixture of pity and respect. They knew this was no ordinary mission. It was the kind that broke history or erased it. The infiltration began under the cover of a moonless night. Sam hacked into alien comms, flooding their systems with phantom signals and false coordinates. The squad slipped through the chaos like shadows, their breaths shallow, their weapons silent. The alien mothership loomed above the clouds, a monstrous silhouette blotting out the stars. Ethan led the way as they boarded a commandeered transport craft, flying dangerously close to patrols, every second a gamble. Lewis nearly lost his nerve when they breached the docking bay, whispering frantically that the enemy would see through them. But luck, or perhaps something stranger, carried them through. They landed inside without alarms blaring, a miracle none dared to acknowledge aloud. Inside the ship, the air felt sterile and humming with energy, as though the walls themselves were alive. The corridors were endless, gleaming with a cold precision that made every step echo like a drumbeat of doom. Sam guided them with stolen schematics, his voice trembling but sharp. Diaz's absence was felt in every pause, every breath, the silence where her steady words should have been. The squad moved forward anyway, deeper into the belly of infinity. Then came the first patrol. Alien soldiers marched in perfect rhythm, their footsteps like the ticking of a clock. Ethan gave a silent signal. Instead of engaging, they slipped into service ducts, crawling through narrow spaces thick with the hum of alien machinery. Sweat poured down their faces as every creak and whisper felt loud enough to give them away. When they emerged, Sam pointed ahead with shaking fingers. The replication core lay beyond. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. A colossal chamber stretched endlessly, filled with pulsing organic machinery, birthing chambers lined in rows like grotesque factories of flesh. Aliens emerged fully armed, stepping into ranks without hesitation, an endless stream of soldiers pouring forth. The sight froze Lewis in terror, his lips trembling as he whispered that this was hopeless. Ethan forced him to look not at the numbers but at the source. In the center of the chamber, a glowing core pulsed like a living heart, each beat spawning another army. "That's it," Ethan said, his voice calm despite the enormity of what they faced. "That's infinity. And infinity can bleed." They planted charges, every move timed and deliberate, but the aliens were not blind. An alarm shrieked, the sound piercing and inhuman. Floods of soldiers poured into the chamber, their weapons raised. The squad fought with desperation, firing in bursts, using the environment as cover, every second bought with blood. Sam's laptop sparked as he forced systems into chaos, doors sealing and unsealing at random. Lewis, terrified beyond reason, accidentally fired into a conduit that triggered an overload, blasting a squad of aliens into ash. His eyes widened in shock, but Ethan clapped him on the shoulder even as they ducked behind cover. "See? Even mistakes count if you make them big enough." Then came Warlord Kthar himself, stepping into the chamber with a presence that froze the air. His voice boomed, mocking and furious. "You human! You dared make yourself more than you are. A single piece on the board pretending to be the player." Ethan rose from cover, rifle in hand, his eyes locked on the towering figure. "Funny thing about chess," he called back. "Sometimes a pawn makes it to the other side." Their duel began amid the chaos. Kthar wielded a blade of energy that carved through steel, while Ethan fought with grit and desperation, dodging strikes that could cleave him in two. The squad held off waves of enemies around them, each second a struggle for survival, while Ethan faced the warlord who embodied infinity's arrogance. The battle was brutal. Ethan's weapon jammed, his arm cut by the warlord's blade, pain burning like fire. Yet he refused to yield. He feinted, improvised, and at the last moment turned Kthar's strength against him. As the warlord raised his blade for a killing strike, Ethan hurled a detonator directly into the replication core. The explosion ripped through the chamber, fire and light swallowing everything. Kthar roared in fury as the core cracked, the endless stream of soldiers faltering, collapsing mid-formation. The walls shook, alarms blared, the mothership shuddered as though dying. Ethan staggered back, bleeding and half-conscious, but alive. His squad dragged him toward the escape routes as chaos consumed the chamber. The replication engines collapsed one by one, spilling sparks and smoke, their perfection undone in a single move. The squad stumbled into the docking bay, pursued by broken remnants of alien soldiers whose once perfect march now stuttered like broken machines. They barely made it onto a stolen craft as fire consumed the ship. As they fled into the night sky, the mothership cracked open in a final, deafening roar, spilling debris across the heavens. Infinity had been broken. Ethan slumped against the wall of the transport, his body trembling, his vision fading. Sam shouted triumphantly that the core was gone. Lewis sat wide-eyed, staring at his trembling hands, whispering that maybe numbers weren't everything after all. For the first time since the invasion began, the stars above seemed to belong to Earth again. Ethan smiled through blood and exhaustion, whispering words that only his squad could hear. "Infinity's just another number. And numbers don't matter when people play the game." Then he closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in the quiet satisfaction of a man who had turned the impossible into possible, knowing the fight was not over, but the tide had changed forever. The destruction of the replication core rippled across the battlefield like a sudden shift in gravity. On every front, alien forces faltered. Their perfect formation stumbled, their endless streams of reinforcements cut short mid-stride, leaving gaping holes in once flawless armies. Soldiers who had braced for annihilation looked up in disbelief as the tide actually receded. For the first time since the invasion began, humanity saw not just survival but a chance to win. In streets where ash still fell like snow, civilians wept openly, clutching each other in desperate relief. Broadcasts across the globe replayed the images of the mothership's collapse, and though no official credit was given, whispers spread like wildfire. It was Ethan Cross. The man who had turned infinity into nothing. The man who had shown that numbers were not destiny. Yet even in the glow of victory, the weight of sacrifice pressed down like lead. Ethan was carried from the transport barely conscious, blood seeping through torn bandages, his face pale. Medics swarmed him, their voices sharp and hurried, but Ethan waved them off with the stubborn defiance of someone too tired to be ordered around. His squad hovered nearby, exhausted but alive, each one carrying fresh scars. Sam clutched his cracked laptop like a holy relic, muttering about how many times it nearly fried him. Lewis sat in silence, his hands still trembling as if the echoes of battle refused to leave him. They had done the impossible, but none of them felt invincible. They felt hollow, filled with loss as much as triumph. The aliens did not vanish completely. Across the world, fragments of their armies fought on, leaderless but still lethal. Some retreated to orbit, their ships circling like vultures waiting for the chance to descend again. But their broadcasts had changed. No longer mocking, no longer filled with laughter, they now spoke Ethan's name with something that was not hatred but fear. Warlord Cthar had fallen, his last roar swallowed by fire, but his final words echoed among the surviving commanders. The Immeasurable One. That was what they called Ethan. Not a soldier, not a human, but something that had broken the equation itself. They promised they would regroup, they would return, and when they did, they would bring not just infinity but vengeance. The world trembled at the threat, but for the moment, Earth had room to breathe. Celebration spread across cities that had been little more than ruins days before. Fires burned not from destruction but from bonfires, as people gathered in streets to sing, to cheer, to remember what victory felt like. In one camp, soldiers hoisted drinks, laughing louder than they had in months. In another, children played again, their laughter sharp and sweet against the backdrop of collapsed buildings. Memes flooded hacked alien channels, mocking their obsession with numbers. One image showed Ethan's face superimposed over a calculator flashing error, shared so widely even some alien transmissions picked it up, much to their fury. For once, humor was not just rebellion. It was triumph. But Ethan himself did not join the celebration. When he was strong enough to walk, he slipped away from the noise and found himself in the quiet of a graveyard outside what remained of a small town. There, among hastily dug markers and weathered stones, he found the grave his squad had made for Diaz. He knelt in the dirt, tracing the makeshift wooden cross with hands still bandaged, his jaw clenched. The victory that had saved billions felt cold in the face of the one face missing from their circle. He spoke quietly, words meant only for the dead. "We made it, but not all of us. I wish you could have seen their faces when the ship went down. I wish you could have laughed with us one more time." The wind carried no answer, only the distant sound of rebuilding. Ethan sat there for a long while, letting grief settle into something he could carry. When he returned, his squad waited. Sam with his sharp grin, Lewis with eyes still wide from all he had seen, both of them looking to Ethan not just as their leader but as the anchor that kept them from drifting. They spoke little, because words felt small, but their presence was enough. Together they rebuilt their weapons, repaired what little gear they had, and prepared for whatever came next. They knew the war was not finished. Victory over the core had shifted the balance, but it had not ended the fight. The aliens were wounded, humiliated, but not gone. They would return, stronger and angrier, and Earth would need to be ready. Ethan saw it in their faces, the same fear he felt himself, but also the same determination. If they had survived infinity once, they could do it again. Across the world, governments scrambled to reorganize, to rebuild armies and infrastructures that had been shattered. For once, their voices carried less arrogance and more humility. They spoke of unity, of lessons learned, though Ethan suspected old rivalries would soon return. But he also knew something had shifted permanently. Humanity had seen its own fragility and its own strength. They had learned that numbers could be mocked, twisted, overcome. And at the heart of that lesson stood a soldier who refused to bow to arithmetic. The myth of Ethan Cross grew larger by the day, his story told in trenches, in shelters, in classrooms rebuilt from rubble. Some called him a hero, others a fool blessed by luck, but all agreed on one truth. He had changed the war. The final alien broadcast came weeks later. A single ship hovered at the edge of the atmosphere, transmitting across every channel. The warlord who appeared on screen was scarred and furious, but his voice carried none of the laughter that had once haunted Earth. "We will return," he vowed, his eyes burning like suns. "But when we do, it will not be to count you. It will be to break the Immeasurable One." The feed cut, leaving silence behind. Some shivered at the promise, others clenched their fists. Ethan simply smiled faintly, a tired smile that spoke of defiance rather than arrogance. They had already broken infinity once. They could do it again. On the night the first stars appeared unobscured by alien ships, Ethan sat with his squad around a small fire. Sam joked about writing a memoir titled How to Cheat at Math and win a war. Louis laughed nervously but genuinely, the sound no longer trembling. Ethan lifted a battered canteen, raising it like a glass. To numbers, he said, his voice steady but soft. May they never matter more than people. They drank, and for a moment, beneath a sky that finally belonged to Earth again, silence carried not fear but peace. The war was not finished, but it had changed. And Ethan Cross, the soldier who laughed at infinity, had given humanity more than a victory. He had given them a future.